we need to take a step back and ask the question, where did the name Windrush come from? How did it come to be so dominant in a discourse about the presence and settlement of black people, particularly black people from the Caribbean, in this society? Because unless we understand that, we won't understand why it was adopted as it was by the British state, and why certain people of Caribbean background found it so convenient to join the state in falsifying the history of black settlement in Britain. I'll unpack all of that in a minute. So let's remember, Windrush comes from the name of that ship, the Empire Windrush, which sailed from the Caribbean and docked in East London on the 21st of June, 1948. Passengers disembarked on the morning of the 22nd of June. First of all, people talk about Windrush, and then they very rarely talk about the Empire Windrush. Now, that is very significant, okay? Because the decision by the British state, having acquired these ships from the German people whom they had defeated in the Second World War, to name that particular ship the Empire Windrush, Windrush being the name of a village, of a river in the Cotswolds. I mean, they could have called it the Windrush. That was the name of the river. They called it the Empire Windrush in order to send out a message, because it was the British Empire at war against the Nazis. The British were hanging onto the residue of empire, and they wanted it to be very, very clear that that ship was coming into the ownership of the British Empire. Now, that is significant, you see, when you consider the provenance of the people whom that ship then brought to Britain. Because before we could begin to talk about the Windrush scandal and how those people who had been settled here for generations were treated, we have to understand where they came from, right? That romanticizing of the Caribbean presence and what people came here to do, and every time I hear the term building modern Britain, it grates on me, because it is such a load of bloody nonsense. All right. So let's stay with that. So Britain was an empire. It was a colonial power. It had expanded domestically by exploiting Africans who were enslaved and brought to the Caribbean. When the British Parliament passed the Abolition of Slavery Act, as is well known, they compensated the former slave owners for loss of property. In other words, those people, very, very British, including the monarchy, including the Church of England, owned all of these Africans as they do cattle or horses or whatever else it may be. They were chattels. And they were compensated for losing their labor So if you own a body of people, you don't compensate them for enslaving them and milking them to death, but you get compensation because you're no longer able to milk them to death. It means, therefore, that they're not just in no man's land. You've got some responsibility for them. If I am to understand myself, I can't begin with my birth in the Caribbean in a little village in 1945. I'm not a Caribbean person, right? I am not native and indigenous to the Caribbean. Those who were Arawaks, Caribs, they were all decimated by the British, who came to clear them out. Some of them died as a result of the diseases that these Europeans brought, in order that they could then use their land and exploit us to create wealth. So that is my provenance. To the extent that I don't even know which part of Africa my forebears came from. I was given the name John. Presumably there was some barbaric individual called John who owned estates, and my forebears worked on those estates. So the erasure was of my very identity as an African person in terms of my genealogy, my ancestry, my ancestral religious practices, beliefs, all that sort of stuff. And it was systemic. Yeah, they made sure that people didn't continue to use their languages. They mixed people up from different parts of Africa. It was a process of systematic erasure. Okay. And then, of course, all the wealth had been drained out of the country. People were still being used pretty much as chattel labor, because after abolition and the compensation of these slave owners, the enslaved were still required to work as apprentices for decades before they actually got their final freedom. And some of them had to work as apprentices to buy their freedom. And the lands stayed in the keep of descendants of those slave owners. The accessible lands remained with the plantations. The people like my father and his grandparents, my great-grandparents were enslaved Africans. The generation coming after them had to work little parcels of land way up in the hills, inaccessible, frankly, even to goats, never mind to human beings, right? Okay, and it is really the remnants of that plantation system that enabled people to eke out an existence. You can't tell the story of Caribbean migration unless you engage with Arthur Lewis, St. Lucian born, he who would become a Nobel laureate first in the Caribbean. Arthur Lewis wrote that book, Labor in the West Indies. It was a pamphlet written for the Fabian Society here in Britain to tell the British about the conditions under which these enslaved Africans, formerly enslaved, were working in the Caribbean. It's a gruesome read. And it explained why there was that massive period of worker unrest across the region. Grenada, Trinidad and Tobago, Antigua, St. Kitts, Jamaica. Throughout that 1930s period, pretty much until the start of the Second World War. So when those people like Sam King and all of these other ex-service personnel were leaving the Caribbean to volunteer to join the British in a war which they had nothing to do with, let's remember, they were coming as colonial subjects, right? They were coming as colonial subjects to give their lives in a war which was supposed to keep Britain free from Nazism. And they were leaving the conditions I've just described. You know, people talk about these war veterans, etc., as if they came from nowhere. As if they themselves didn't have a history. How did they come? Where did the West India Regiment come from? They weren't fighting wars. They weren't fighting wars, internecine wars in the Caribbean or the West Indies. They came as people who had been colonized, and they were citizens of the United. I'll come to that in a minute. But they were citizens of the United Kingdom by virtue of colonization. And they came in droves and joined the British Army. But they didn't just join the British Army, they joined the racism within the British Army. And what they discovered, even as they risked their lives, was there was a racist classification going on there in terms of who could get promotion, who could become officers, who get to do the nasty work and were always on the front line, who dug the trenches, who emptied the toilets, who were skivvies for the officers and so on. That was the reality. And many of them have written about it. Okay, so what I'm trying to suggest is there is a link, all right? There's a link between their enslavement from Africa, the way British colonialism and imperialism treated them as the descendants of enslaved Africans, how they came to be in Britain, and what happened after they came to Britain.